Good afternoon. We are coming on the air with breaking news. Former President Donald Trump has made his choice. Mr. Trump just posted on his social media platform, Truth Social, that Ohio Senator J.D. Vance will be his running mate and Republican nominee for vice president ahead of this year's general election. So this year's Republican ticket will be Trump Vance. Senator Vance has been in the Senate for less than 2 years, but has aligned himself consistently with Mr. Trump during that time. The news comes just before they're both set to be formally nominated today on the first day of the Republican National Convention. It also comes less than 48 hours after the assassination attempt on Mr. Trump at his rally over the weekend, as well as just hours after the documents case was dismissed by the judge in Florida. Our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson, joins me live now with this breaking news. Hallie, you and I have been working our sources throughout the day. Not a huge surprise because we learned that North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum was out. We learned that Senator Marco Rubio was out. How do you think the party faithful will respond to this pick?
J.D. Vance, the freshman first-term senator from Ohio, is widely seen, as you well know, Kristen, as the next generation of the MAGA movement, if you will. He is somebody who has had the strong and outspoken support of not just, clearly, former President Trump, but his son, Donald Trump Jr., who's been a big advocate for J.D. Vance all along. And in conversations with sources before this moment, one of the things that I've heard is that Senator Vance could be helpful to the former president in some of those rural, exurban areas of some of these critical Rust Belt states, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. Listen, those are not places where former President Trump would have likely been at risk of not doing well, but perhaps on the turnout push, there is some indication that that is where they like J.D. Vance. They like Senator Vance. You have the former president in this Truth Social today saying that after lengthy deliberation and thought and considering the tremendous talents of many others, he has decided, of course, that the person, as he says, best suited to assume the position is, in fact, Senator Vance. You can see that post here. And this comes at a moment, Kristen, where we are just minutes away from this ticket becoming, let's call it, official, no longer presumptive, with former President Trump any minute now set to go, as we call it, over the top and get enough delegates to lock up the nomination. I can tell you, based on my reporting, and I know you've been working your sources too, the other two contenders on the short list, as NBC News had reported, was Florida Senator Marco Rubio and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. I am told by a source that, as it relates to Senator Rubio, there was a concern about that residency requirement, about both men being in the same place. That is partly why they felt like they couldn't get to a good resolution on that. He's not the pick, and I know you've been talking to your Burgum sources too.
I have been, and look, Burgum was widely seen, Hallie, as someone who would have been safe. He would have never overshadowed Donald Trump. And the pick of J.D. Vance is so fascinating. This is The Apprentice pick in some ways.
The drama, the intrigue on this pick.
And he's really seen as the future of the MAGA movement. Now, there are some who are worried. Will this resonate with moderates, with independents, with those Nikki Haley voters who Donald Trump needs to win over if he wants to win this election, Hallie?
It's a great point, and I think that part of the calculus here, too, with Senator Vance has been the way, listen, we know Donald Trump. We know what the former president likes. He likes people who speak out strongly and forcefully on his behalf. And boy, Senator Vance has certainly made the rounds doing that over the course of the former president's campaign here. Wasn't always that way, as I know we'll get into, but there is obviously a sense of installing somebody here, I think clearly based on this pick, and reading through this long Truth Social again that lays out, of course, J.D. Vance's resume here, this online post, a sense that he will be somebody who is loyal to former President Trump. All of it, of course, we have to note, as this convention, I mean, this is literally just the beginning of this significant moment for the Republican Party, and it's taken on a different tone, of course, since that assassination attempt against former President Trump less than 48 hours ago. He is now here in Milwaukee at this critical moment for the party, the first time that we have seen a vice presidential pick rolled out this century, in a couple of decades, at a convention and not before.
The history is just fascinating. Hallie, let's bring in our Capitol Hill correspondent, Ryan Nobles. Ryan, of course, this pick comes against the backdrop just days after that assassination attempt against former President Trump. So there is a bit of a somber feeling as well that is kicking off this convention. We should say, you hear the noise behind me. They are in the process of officially nominating Donald Trump to be their party's nominee, and we are just moments away from getting to Ohio, the home state of J.D. Vance. What are you hearing there, Ryan?
Well, Kristen, I think that for many of us on Capitol Hill, J.D. Vance was thought to be the front runner in this contest from almost the very beginning. He was someone thought of to be very loyal to Donald Trump, especially when he made the decision to run for elective office. Of course, J.D. Vance's story is a pretty remarkable American story, someone that was born into poverty, spending time in both Kentucky and Ohio. He, of course, was the author of that blockbuster book, Hillbilly Elegy, which came out right around the time Donald Trump was elected president back in 2016, and it became, in many ways, a thesis of the average American in middle America who resonated and connected with Donald Trump. And in many ways, J.D. Vance was called upon to try and decode the explanations behind which someone like Donald Trump could resonate with that community, because he was someone who understood the people of those communities. Now, it's important to point out that initially J.D. Vance was not a very strong supporter of Donald Trump. He was very critical of him throughout the 2016 campaign. But as time went on, after Donald Trump won that election, and when Vance himself began to explore the idea of political office, he became more and more aligned with the MAGA movement, became very close with Donald Trump Jr. and members of the Trump family. And then when he decided to run for the seat that was being left open by Rob Portman in Ohio, that's when he really fully embraced the MAGA movement and really ran as a MAGA candidate and successfully collected Donald Trump's nomination in that primary process, which played a big role in securing that primary and then ultimately seeing him elected to the United States Senate. He's someone without a lot of governing experience, right? He was just elected to the Senate back in 2022, so he hasn't even served a full 2 years. He does not have a great deal of seniority as a result of that. In fact, he's the second youngest member of the United States Senate. So this is an interesting pick, a compelling one for President Trump.
I want to turn to our guests here on set. Chuck Todd, NBC News chief political analyst, and Mark Short, an NBC News political analyst who knows a little something about vice presidential picks. Mark, I'm going to get to you in a minute. Chuck, let me start with you. Yes. You and I have been trying to figure out who's it going to be for weeks, if not months. It is J.D. Vance. It's a sign that Donald Trump is doubling down on his MAGA principles. The question is, from an electoral perspective, does this help him? I mean, does it help him win over Nikki Haley voters? Does it help him win over moderates, independents?
This doesn't feel like a political pick to me, or an election or a campaign pick. This feels like a messaging pick, as you put it, or, you know, look, I think it makes a really sort of makes a dramatic shift in the direction of the party. Like, if you didn't know where this party is headed, it is a much different party, a protectionist party on trade, a little bit more isolationist, depending on how your point of view on that, but a version of certainly less international expansion when it comes to American national security. Look, I think it's notable it's the first veteran on a ticket since John McCain.
Yeah.
And I think it's notable that he chose a millennial. The generational thing is not, you know, and I think you certainly can see J.D. Vance as being a very articulate spokesperson outside of the boomers. But this comes with risk, because there's a lot of paper trail on him. He's only been a senator for 2 years. He sort of is a convert to all this, right? He's not even 40. Look, Mark and I are a little bit older. Like, you know, your life, you know, it's funny how your own politics can shift and evolve. You know, he's so new. He was new to the Never Trump movement in 16. Then he was new to the MAGA movement in 18. You know, here he is. You know, so you know, we'll see. I think Democrats, of all the candidates that he could have picked, this is the one they hope Trump would pick. So that tells you something. They feel like there's a lot of material to work with. And I think just like with Sarah Palin, who's the last time someone with this little electoral experience ended up on a ticket, it's a race to define him nationally, and this is going to be quite the race. Well,
and as you say that, Chuck, the Biden campaign is already saying they are going to paint him as extreme. We should note that our White House team is reporting that the Vice President Kamala Harris, has called J.D. Vance. She apparently left a message. Mark Short wasn't able to reach him. You obviously are a top aide to former Vice President Mike Pence. You were a part of that process. You remember it well when he was chosen to be Trump's running mate. Talk a little bit about this moment, the significance of it, and what you make of the pick of J.D. Vance. As Chuck says, it's not without risks.
Well, look, I think it's a very different time in 2024 than it was in 2016.
Yes.
When we were here in Cleveland, don't forget, the number 2, Ted Cruz, number 2 candidate in the primary, refused to endorse Donald Trump at the convention. And so I think that Mike Pence brought many of the conservatives, the Tea Party conservatives, to the party. I don't think that's the case at this point. To Chuck's point, I think it's less of a political pick, but it's a dramatic shift in where the party is going. It's not just the isolationist foreign policy. It's not just a protectionist trade policy. It's a guy who wants a bigger regulatory state. It's a guy who's applauded Biden's FTC commissioner at a time when most Republicans are most concerned that many trade deals are getting tied up because of a burdensome regulatory environment. And so it's a very, very populist pick, in no way a traditional conservative pick.
Yeah, I mean, he was right at the center of so much of the debate over whether to send more money to Ukraine. He was absolutely opposed to it, to your point. He really underscores those isolationist
You know, Kristen, he went to
ideals.
the Munich Security Conference.
Yeah.
And advocated basically for less aid for Ukraine. It
Right.
was a dramatic thing for him to do, but it was really uncomfortable for most people at the Munich conference because they're not used to an American or, you know, somebody coming representing the United States sort of advocating for a retreat.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that issue. On so many other issues, Democrats are going to be looking at this pick and have plenty to work with. Let me go to Garrett Haake, who is on the convention floor as well, right in the middle of all of the action. Garrett, where are you? What are the delegates telling you where you are?
Well, Kristen, I'm in the back of the hall right now with New Mexico at the moment. I was talking to delegates as the pick was becoming news, and I heard a lot of welcome to it. You know, I spoke to members of the Idaho delegation. I spoke to some folks in the Michigan delegation, and I think we shouldn't be surprised that the people in this room are very excited about the J.D. Vance pick. That's the idea. I mean, this is the pick of a confident campaign here who thinks that their strategy is working and they just need somebody who can help them execute it a little better. If you're the Trump campaign trying to reach these, you know, battleground Rust Belt state voters, those young men in particular disaffected from the Democratic Party, J.D. Vance, the only veteran of the 4 main players on this ticket, can be your guy. I heard that in Michigan. I heard that in Idaho. And I heard it from Laura Trump, the vice chair of the RNC and the president's daughter-in-law, who really told me that she does see this as almost a laying of hands to Donald Trump, actually picking a successor, something he has not really wanted to do, but identifying somebody who can be the next generation MAGA voice in J.D. Vance.
I think you're absolutely right. And Kimberly Guilfoyle earlier during an interview with Jacob Soboroff, Garrett, really focused on that point, the importance of the vice presidential pick. Chuck, she was making the case that this pick takes on new significance in the wake of that assassination attempt against former President Trump. Yet another moment in this presidential race that we could not have imagined, and that quite frankly has upended the race once again.
No, and I also think it means more people. I mean, this is both the opportunity and risk.
Yes.
And I say the opportunity, I think there are more people in America wanting to see how Donald Trump's responding, are going to want to say, after given the events, and by the way, his age and Joe Biden's age, where the vice presidential debate will feel a little more significant. But I also want to ratchet things back here. There have been plenty of vice presidential picks that have been negatives on candidates who have won the presidency anyway. Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, George H.W. Bush and Dan Quayle. So I am not, and some would even would argue that Joe Biden didn't pick the strongest running mate at times. So, you know, I don't, this election isn't going to be decided by the running mates. What these running mates can do, though, is become distractions. To me, they're never net positives for a campaign. They only are either neutral or they are distractions.
Yeah.
And that's, you just hope it isn't too big of a distraction.
And Trump is someone, Mark Short, who you get the sense he picks a running mate almost begrudgingly. He doesn't really think he needs a running mate in some senses. It does come against, again, the backdrop of this horrific assassination attempt against the former president. We cannot forget that is sort of infusing this entire event. And one of the things I'll be watching for is the tone. Right now, it's obviously incredibly celebratory. They are celebrating celebrating the fact that Donald Trump has officially become their party's nominee. But I think in the speeches, it will be fascinating to see. He said he's rewritten his speech to be one of unity.
Right. Well, look, I think that J.D. Vance, I don't think hurts Trump politically. I accept Chuck's point. I don't know what he really adds to it. But I think this race can be about the top two of the ticket. It gets very polarizing. But he's a rags to riches story. He's a man who served the Marines. He served our country. He's an incredibly articulate spokesman. I do go back to our first point, though. It is a dramatic shift in what the Republican Party believes and stands for. And I think that that can't be underscored enough. It's a direct signal that we're headed in a far more populist direction with our policy than the traditional conservatism that this party has stood for so many decades.
Mark, you were saying this to me. You actually think he hired a spokesperson. That's how he almost views J.D. Vance, as a spokesperson for the movement.
He's incredibly articulate, and he can represent the president's viewpoints. And I think in many ways, that is what he saw as the advantage in J.D. Vance, is somebody who can go out there and be his surrogate.
Almost what Pete Buttigieg, the role Pete Buttigieg plays for Joe Biden.
Well, and we've seen J.D. Vance. We've seen, quite frankly, all of the vice presidential candidates out on the circuit, running the traps, doing the tough interviews. Garrett, before I let you go, because I know it's very loud where you are, talk a little bit about your understanding of how the horrific assassination attempt against former President Trump might impact, might infuse this convention. As you have reported, he is overhauling his speech, and yet we don't necessarily expect every speech to be changed.
No, that's right, Kristen. And I think we should probably adjust our standards accordingly for what Donald Trump's idea of a speech more about unity will be about. I mean, this is what he said. He said he's basically taken out a speech that he thought was too tough, and now he wants to unite the country. A few hours later, he sent out a Truth Social post about the documents case getting thrown out, in which he used a lot of the same divisive language for which he's become known, talking about hoaxes and witch hunts and Joe Biden-led conspiracies. So his idea of a unifying message can often mean unify around me where I am, as opposed to I'm going to put my arms around you and we're all going to move closer together. So I think we should probably moderate our expectations in that way. And I think just even looking at the speakers tonight, for example, somebody like a Glenn Youngkin offers a very different sense of a unifying figure than does Marjorie Taylor Greene, both of whom on the speaker's card tonight. There's sort of only so much you can move a party that has become so aggressive in sort of its natural posture back towards a kinder, gentler, big tent welcome, which is, I think, what obviously you want your convention to present when you're trying to reach some of those voters who may not have been paying attention until later in the political year.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good day. We're coming on the air with breaking news. Sources inform NBC News that Vice President Kamala Harris has selected Tim Walz as her running mate. Harris is now informing the contenders. This makes the Democratic ticket official. Harris-Walz heading into the party convention later this month. Tim Walz, the governor, popular two-term governor, elected in 2018. He is a former high school teacher and former coach who went on to represent Minnesota in Congress for 12 years. The 60-year-old also served for more than 2 decades in the Army National Guard. Harris and Walz will appear together for the first time later today at a rally in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. Let's bring in our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. Peter, what do we know about Tim Walz and this decision-making process?
Lester, we know that we're going to see him for the first time on stage alongside Kamala Harris just a matter of hours from now after we get the formal unveiling from the campaign, expected to happen early this morning. That event will happen here in Philadelphia. Notably, another vice presidential potential pick, Josh Shapiro, Pennsylvania's governor, will also be in attendance. To give you a little better understanding about Tim Walz right now, he is a popular 2-term governor. Among other things, he sort of checks that box of what we have been reporting that Kamala Harris was looking for a governing partner who served 12 years in Congress. Notably, he's one of the rare Democrats who represented a rural community in Minnesota. It's part of that plain-spoken style that, as we understand it, may have appealed to Kamala Harris right now. Among the desires for her going forward is to try to secure that critical blue wall, the key states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan as well. The hope, according to those close to this process, is that she, with him at her side, will be be able to help secure those key battleground states. Without them, certainly without Pennsylvania, Kamala Harris cannot win the presidential race. So beyond the rural appeal, he is also the Democratic Governors Association's head. He leads that organization of governors across the country right now, and he did make an impression on the Harris team over the course of what has been a rapid-fire vetting process. It was Walz himself who first used that word weird to describe not Republicans, but Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, the ticket, a phrase, a word that ultimately we saw many others throughout the Democratic Party, some of Vice President Harris's own surrogates using in the days that followed. Lester, just to pull back the curtain for a second, I'm told by a source familiar with this process that as of late last night, Kamala Harris, the vice president, had not yet made up her mind that she wanted to sleep on it for another night. And to give you a better understanding of how this was going down to the wire, the campaign, the Harris campaign, had printed signs, a variety of different signs that they could use no matter who she picked, with her name on top and a variety of different names beneath it. Joe Biden notably did the same. He had signs for 12 possible scenarios made back in 2020. But again, that's the most information we have at this time as we learn more about Tim Walz right now. In our conversations with those familiar with this process, there were sort of 3 C's that she had been looking for. She wanted someone that demonstrated competence, someone that also had shared sort of a personal chemistry with her and, frankly, with her husband, Doug Emhoff, who had participated in a lot of this process as well, and also someone who they felt very strongly could help secure some of those key states going forward. As we noted, Minnesota, not a state that the Democrats are worried about, a state that the Democratic Party has not lost since 1972, but some of those key neighbors, including Wisconsin right next door, Michigan and Pennsylvania, are obviously key for her. We're going to be watching this over the course of the morning. Lester will keep you posted as we gather more from our sources.
All right, Peter Alexander, we'll ask you to stand by. Thanks. Tim Walz may not be a name those outside of Minnesota are familiar with up until today. NBC's Gabe Gutierrez has more on his background.
A working-class politician from a rural background, Minnesota's Tim Walz is known for not pulling punches.
This is not about the Second Amendment. This is about the safety of our children and our communities.
A self-described white dude for Kamala Harris, the popular governor will now run alongside the nation's first woman of color atop a major party's ticket. Walz grew up in small-town Nebraska and joined the National Guard as a teenager. He'd serve in the National Guard for more than 2 decades, eventually becoming a school teacher. After moving to Minnesota, he volunteered for John Kerry's presidential campaign, and in an upset, he was elected to Congress in 2006. Walz served in Washington for the next 12 years, establishing himself as a moderate Democrat. Then he ran for governor in 2018, winning in a landslide.
The process of how we as a state and how we as a nation respond to these things is really important.
2020 would bring defining moments, the COVID pandemic and the killing of George Floyd, which triggered riots and criticism from Republicans over why it took Walz 3 days to call in the National Guard.
Decisions were made in a situation that is what it is, and I simply believe that we tried to do the best we can.
Walz's critics also point to a state audit report that found major failures by Minnesota's education department during the pandemic, allowing rampant misuse of a federal program meant to feed children.
If you commit fraud in Minnesota, you are going to be caught and you are going to go to prison.
Still, Walz has long had strong union support. The president of the United Auto Workers says he was among his top choices for VP.
I had an opponent who thought this was a real zinger when we were going at it. He said, Governor Walz is in the pocket of organized labor. And I said, that is a damn lie. I am the pocket.
Walz is also seen as an attack dog, not shy about going after former President Trump or his running mate, Senator J.D. Vance.
Well, it's true. These guys are just weird. And it's, you know, they're running for He-Man Women Haters Club or something.
Now, the plain-spoken 60-year-old governor from the Midwest is set to join a historic national ticket. Gabe Gutierrez, NBC News.
Bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson. Now, Hallie, obviously, Republicans doing their homework right now, trying to figure out how to run against Governor Walz. What are you hearing?
Well, they've done their homework apparently pretty quickly, Lester, because we're already hearing now some reaction from the Trump camp going after Tim Walz for essentially his record, the policies that he put in place, that he backed as a member of Congress and that he put in place as governor of Minnesota, linking him to what they call the Biden-Harris agenda on immigration, on gun legislation, on climate, for example, and describing the newly named now Harris-Walz ticket as a team of radicals. That's a quote now from Team Trump. This is not altogether unexpected, as Peter has laid out. There had been some, what you might call, Walz-mentum that had been in play over the course of the last week or so. Some talk about what Tim Walz could bring to the ticket, what he could do for Vice President Kamala Harris, as she is now officially on the top of the ticket on the Democratic side. Keep in mind his policy record. As governor of Minnesota, he, for example, signed some gun safety laws into place in 2023, as Gabe mentioned. On abortion rights, he has been somebody who signed a law that enshrined those in the state of Minnesota. He has been out front on things like universal free school lunch meals as well. These are some of the issues that progressives have really liked from Tim Walz. And that's what makes him so interesting here, Lester, because on the one hand, he has the backing of people like Bernie Sanders, like Pramila Jayapal, head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. But on the other hand, you're seeing some talk from those in the Midwest about his rural credentials, if you will, having grown up in Nebraska, the way that they believe he can connect with people like those rural exurban voters in some of those so-called Rust Belt critical battleground states, as well as his background as a veteran, somebody who can speak to that community and relate to that group of voters as well. Now, there is some consternation, I think, that you're also seeing on the Republican side, and some of this may be trying to, you know, inject some chatter into the atmosphere there of the idea that Kamala Harris passed over Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor, popular governor in that state, which is a critical battleground. Pennsylvania is a must-win for either side here coming up in November. And Shapiro outpolls President Biden in that state. He has done well in Pennsylvania. There had been some concern. He is more moderate. There had been some concern on the progressive side about Governor Shapiro. Although, again, you know, he is somebody who is expected to back the Harris ticket and to still be a part of campaigning for Harris. But when you look at those two states, Minnesota hasn't gone red since 1972. That state has backed a Democrat in the presidential election now for decades. It is not considered a quote-unquote traditional swing state, although you sort of always see Republicans the last couple of cycles say maybe they'll try to play there. You saw former President Trump there just recently as well. So Tim Walz, now the pick, as NBC News is reporting. We expect to see both him and the vice president later on tonight in Philly, Lester, for what is a critical moment in this campaign.
All right, Hallie, thanks very much. Tim Walz spent more than a decade in Congress. Our Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles joins us now. What more can you tell me about his time in Congress?
Well, Lester, this is certainly a characteristic of Tim Walz's career that will be very beneficial to Kamala Harris. This is an individual who spent more than a decade as a member of the House of Representatives in the not-too-distant past. He left Congress in 2019, and so he has the added advantage of being an executive in a Midwestern state while at the same time understanding how Washington works. And he's developed a number of relationships with congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle during his time in the House of Representatives. And it's also important to keep in mind that there is a history of presidential tickets, including members of the House of Representatives. In fact, you have to go back to the 1940s to find a time where there wasn't at least one person on the ticket, either Republican or Democrat, who had at least spent some time in the House of Representatives. So Tim Walz continues that streak by being added to Kamala Harris's ticket as well. He is someone who is considered affable, somebody who can get along with people, even people that he disagrees with. And that may be important to Kamala Harris as she looks for a governing partner and what heads into what her term could ultimately be if she is successful in November. There is a real possibility that there will be divided government in Washington, regardless of who wins the presidential race. There is a very tight contest in the House of Representatives. All 435 seats will be up. And the Senate, the map favors Republicans versus Democrats. So there's a possibility that Democrats may not control either house. They may only control one house. And so it will be beneficial to Kamala Harris, who did spend time in the Senate, but not that much time, to have someone like Tim Walz who understands how the legislative process works and what it will take to push through key agenda items that Kamala Harris and he care about. Now, Walz is someone who does have the benefit of having a lot of support among the progressive members of the Democratic Party. As Hallie rightly points out, the chair of the Progressive Caucus and others are big supporters of Walz, but at the same time, he also has good relationships with members of the moderate wing of the party as well. So he is the type of person that could bring both sides together when the Democratic Party is looking to unify at a key time. So someone who understands what's happening in the middle of America as a Midwestern governor, Lester, but someone who also understands the inner workings of Washington, someone poised to be a very good governing partner for Kamala Harris, and that seems to be at least part of her calculation in selecting Tim Walz as her running mate. Lester?
Okay, Ryan, thanks. I want to bring in our senior and national political reporter, Jonathan Allen. Jonathan, we're about 2 weeks away from the Democratic convention. How does this pick now align this party and how to move forward?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways, Lester, that it aligns Democrats. Number one, as Ryan was attesting to, this is someone that's very familiar to Democratic activists, to the Democratic core. He'll have to be introduced, I think, to the broader set of the electorate within the party and outside the party. But Tim Walz is very experienced as a campaigner. I also think there's a little sub-rosa thing going on here, Lester, which is Democrats have been having difficulty because of President Biden and Vice President Harris's position on Israel. They've been having difficulty with Arab voters, with Muslim voters, most notably in Michigan. Tim Walz is somebody who's been elected in a state with a significant Muslim population that is very much behind him and has appreciated his governorship. And that's something that they may be able to tout as they go forward, somebody who has that relationship as Democrats try to bring back some of those voters.
Is he going to be a unifying force within the party?
Oh, absolutely, Lester. Here's somebody who is basically a progressive but has been able to win over a significant number of independent and Republican voters in his own state. And that's something that will, if he's not the exciting candidate on the ticket, I think that's going to be fine with Kamala Harris. She's bringing that energy. But absolutely somebody that will assure a lot of Democrats, both Midwesterners and moderates, and also the progressives.
Jonathan Allen, thanks. Let's bring back our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson. Hallie, what do we know about how voters feel about Tim Walz?
So this is an interesting one, Lester, and the answer seems to be they don't know yet, because if you look at some recent numbers out of ABC News Ipsos, about 90%, 87% of Americans just within the last week or so here say they just don't know enough about the Minnesota governor to be able to form an opinion. That's not altogether surprising, Lester. If you don't live in Minnesota and if you're not an avid reader of all, Democratic Governors Association press releases, you might not know a lot about Tim Walz until recently when he sort of burst onto, I want to say, the national scene. He's been on there for a while for political observers, but we're talking about sort of regular folks who are now engaging 90-plus days out from the election in November. In Minnesota, he's had an approval rating of 54%. He's never had a net negative rating. What's interesting here is also the way that you're already seeing now both sides try to define who Tim Walz is. For an American population now with whom he's largely an unknown to them, if you will, Lester. So look at it this way. You've got the Harris team now coming out. You've got backers already. We're hearing a couple of, winks and nods from, for example, Amy Klobuchar, the Minnesota senator, who obviously knows a thing or two about what it's like to run for president, suggesting that today may be a good day for Minnesota. Obviously, the Harris campaign has not made this pick officially official. This is our reporting based on what sources are telling us. But you are going to see the Harris campaign look to define Tim Walz as somebody who can, as John has said, as Ryan and Peter have said, be somebody who can relate to those sort of Midwestern voters, but also to progressives who like the policies that he's put in place. It is the flip when you look at Republicans. And there's this quote that's already getting some attention now from the more conservative side of the aisle, in which last week, within the last week or so, the governor, on a campaign call for Harris, said, don't ever shy away from our progressive values. He said, one person's socialism is another person's neighborliness. You're already seeing Republicans jump on that and run with it, if you will. Walz himself is not running away from his past. He talked about just recently how he is the chair of the DGA, the Democratic Governors Association, and he is drawing that link between Democratic governors and the Biden-Harris agenda. He has said that governors, largely Democratic governors, have run on the Biden-Harris administration agenda in a way that has improved lives. And so I think that gives you a sense of what we might hear from him as we move forward now, and as all eyes are going to be on what we'll see tonight in Philly, Lester.
Thanks for that. Let's talk about it now. Joining me, Peter Alexander. He is on the ground in Philly ahead of tonight's rally. Garrett Hake is here. He has reaction from Trump world. And Steve Kornacki is, where else would he be? He's at the big board. Also with me, Simone Sanders-Townsend, the co-host of The Weekend on MSNBC and a former senior advisor to Vice President Harris. Well, let's go to the room where it's going to happen. Peter, you're in Philly. That's where we'll see Walz and Harris together for the first time. Just walk us through the internal decision-making process here when it came to picking Walz. What about the governor appealed to Harris as she made her choice?
Well, I think, Ryan, there were several key takeaways that appealed. Perhaps most importantly was the strong chemistry, that rapport that the two were able to build in the short time they spent together this past weekend when Walz, among other top contenders, visited the Naval Observatory, the vice president's residence in Washington, D.C. I've been told by multiple sources that that was a key factor here. But it's not just that. They talk about his bio. You've talked about his service in the Army National Guard for 24 years, his 12 years in Congress, winning a Trump district, a red district, also those 2 terms serving as Minnesota's governor. They view that executive experience as something that will make him a good governing partner for Harris moving forward. Beyond that, it is that executive experience, most importantly, that they think puts him in a position to be competent and have the ability to lead. And then ultimately, beyond that, I think it is the sense that he has been an effective messenger to this point. You saw in Gabe's piece moments ago that he was the one who sort of coined that phrase describing Trump and Vance, not Republicans broadly, but the two of them as being weird, something that caught on for a couple weeks, went viral, certainly across the Democratic universe, and certainly something that caught the eyes of Kamala Harris and her team. Ryan.
So after tonight, they're going to hit the road visiting a bunch of battleground states together, but I assume at some point they're going to separate. How does the campaign plan on utilizing Walz? Where do they see his strengths?
Well, as he described himself, he's a white dude for Kamala Harris, and they really hope that he has a particular appeal with his Midwest charm, as they describe it, in some of those key Rust Belt battleground states, the 3 states in particular there that they cannot afford to lose. Recognize that Democrats haven't lost Minnesota since 1972, but it's the states of Wisconsin next door, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, notably, where they need to see success. That's going to be some of his first stops tomorrow in Wisconsin and Michigan alongside Kamala Harris. It's part of what was intended to be 7 states in 5 days. Now it's going to be 5 states in those 5 days. 2 of those events were postponed due to Tropical Storm Debbie, but it's certainly a place where they believe that he can communicate a good message. His rural sort of roots, they think, as a gun owner, a hunter, will resonate with some of those Americans in parts of the country that may have been disinclined to support for Kamala Harris.
And of course, you're in Pennsylvania. The governor there, Josh Shapiro, was considered to be the leading VP contender, probably the other option outside of Walz. He'll be at the rally tonight. We've seen other VP options also praising Harris's choice here. How important is this show of unity for the Democrats?
Well, it was remarkable how quick the unity sort of was presented by this Democratic Party. Recognize, Ryan, remarkably, it's barely been 2 weeks since Joe Biden dropped out of this race, to say nothing of the vetting process that normally takes months and had to be sort of squeezed into just a matter of weeks. The party has really united behind what has been a newly energized Democratic Party without Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. Kamala Harris instead. I'm looking around the room here where they're anticipating as many as 10,000 people to be here. You see some of those lights flickering on the wrists of folks. Those are the types of bracelets you see handed out at a Taylor Swift concert that turn off and change colors in unison here. So there is a very different energy, really night and day compared to what we saw just a matter of weeks ago. And it's something that Harris and Walz together are hoping to capitalize on.
All right, seems like this campaign is now officially off and running. Peter Alexander there for this kickoff for the Harris-Walz team. Peter, thank you for that. Let's bring in Garrett Hake now to talk about what's happening on the other side of the coin, and that's with the Trump campaign. They've already tried to pivot to try and make this race about Harris. How much will they use or not use Walz in making this comparison?
I think Walz is useful to them in the sense that it doesn't complicate their message, right? They can say that they can use Walz to amplify all the things they're already saying about Kamala Harris. If Kamala Harris is open borders, so is Tim Walz. If Kamala Harris is anti-police, so too is Tim Walz. If she is too far left, so too is he. Now, his record in the House certainly doesn't reflect that, but I think they will make arguments that the things he's been able to do with the Democratic trifecta in Minnesota, while popular there, are not things that the rest of the country will want. That's their hope. But beyond that, their response has been kind of rote today, to be completely honest with you. They have tried to paint him as a far-left liberal and Harris as a far-left liberal for choosing him, but they've not gone very much beyond that. I mean, Trump himself has said, in the context of his own vice president, that he doesn't think they mean very much to the ticket, and his campaign is certainly behaving like they don't think Walz is going to mean a lot when the votes actually start coming in on this race.
J.D. Vance used a term today that I thought was interesting. He said that Harris bowed to the Hamas wing of the party.
Yeah.
There's obviously this strain of questioning the pick because Josh Shapiro was passed over. He is, of course, Jewish. There was some reporting that may have been part of the conversation for the Harris campaign. I think that they have kind of batted that down. But Republicans are trying to amplify that. How much do you think that this will become part of their argument to try and sow some discord within the Democratic Party?
I think it's more likely to be a whisper campaign than it is to be the kind of thing they put resources behind or have the candidate or the VP nominee, for that matter, spend a lot of time talking about. But the idea that they might be able to drive a wedge into the Jewish vote around Harris and what she really thinks about Israel and Gaza and what the differences might be between she and Shapiro, I do think is something that some Republicans will try to exploit. I saw comments on X today from Republican strategists and influencers suggesting that maybe Shapiro should join the Republican Party because his views on that issue might be more aligned with Republicans. I'm not sure how far that will get, but it makes me very interested in what Josh Shapiro himself is going to say, not just tonight, but in the months that follow, because he's still an important surrogate, at least in theory, for the Harris campaign.
And also it doesn't really match the reality because Shapiro has been one of the biggest critics of Benjamin Netanyahu of anyone in the Democratic Party, where Walz has been somewhat friendly to Netanyahu. So aside from the identity associated with it, that doesn't really connect there. But there does seem to be a bit of relief, maybe is the right word, among some Republicans that this pick is not coming from a battleground state. Were they worried that it would come from Pennsylvania or Arizona or somewhere like that?
I think a lot of Republicans thought that either Shapiro or Kelly, at least on paper, would be a stronger candidate. And time will tell. But, you know, when I look at the history of this, and this is something you'll talk about with Steve Kornacki, having a battleground state vice presidential candidate certainly didn't help. You know, Joe Biden didn't have one. Donald Trump didn't have one when he won. Barack Obama didn't have one when he won. Like, the idea that this makes some big difference, I'm not sure is entirely borne out. But the idea that you can cause some chaos in the other party by suggesting, oh, man, we really dodged a bullet here because of who they picked or didn't pick, does make a certain amount of strategic sense.
Let's flip it then and talk about the fact that Donald Trump has thought that Minnesota's in play. How does that change the calculation?
I've covered multiple Trump rallies in Minnesota. I think it's a state that's sort of his white whale. It's the kind of state that he always thought he ought to be able to win. The demographics of it, he believes, absent Minneapolis, St. Paul, look a lot more like Iowa, a state where he really does well, than Michigan or Wisconsin, a battleground state where he's struggled. I would not be surprised at all to see Trump still go campaign in Minnesota because it means a lot to him. And I think because that's a sort of in his mind, a way that he can kind of show the dominance that he likes to project politically, that he's going to go into somebody's backyard and campaign. But, you know, look, I think it probably remains just outside of his reach, as it has for the last couple of cycles, but we'll see.
He's also campaigning in Montana, which you think is easily...
critical battleground state, but does have a very important Senate race.
Right, exactly. All right, Garrett, thank you for that. Let's talk about the big board now and bring in Steve, as Garrett pointed out. So here's the question, Steve. I mean, I know you've probably explained this to death about the role that vice presidential candidates have on the top of the ticket. But my specific question is about new voters. Are they going to turn out now for Harris because of Walz's addition on the ticket? I mean, what's the coalition here look like?
Well, yeah, again, and like you say, the history of vice presidential candidates, I think they make the biggest impact often the day they're announced, and people speculate about what the impact will be. So that said, though, what you're hearing from a lot of Democrats here is the hope that broadly there's appeal that Walz brings to the ticket for those three Midwest states you talk about, Midwest, Big Ten states, however you want to define them, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I think particularly Wisconsin next door to Minnesota, and Michigan a little bit too, just demographically. And I think in terms of what impact, one way of looking at it, at least the potential impact of Walz, would simply to be, let's look at Walz's last campaign in Minnesota. For governor 2022, he got reelected by 8 points. But look at the distribution of the votes in the state, because Garrett was just talking about this. You know, Minnesota, you got the Twin Cities area here. I draw a circle. Inside here is about 60% of the population of Minnesota. The rest of this is all what they kind of call greater Minnesota. And essentially, you know, this is what we see in all states, or just about all states. The metro area around the big cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, is blue and getting bluer and bluer. Big population centers, lots of suburbs, lots of college-educated professionals. That's become a core Democratic constituency, especially in the age of Trump. And then greater Minnesota, it's a lot of small towns, it's a lot of rural areas, it's a lot of blue-collar voters. And this has, especially in the Trump era, I mean, you can see it. Look, all the red on here. It's moving more and more in the Republican direction. Just these two geographic units here are moving politically vastly apart from each other. We could talk more about it, I'm sure, over the next few months.
Well, but Minnesota, though, is Midwestern, but it's not a swing state in the same way its neighbors are. So, you know, you talked about this. Is there a broader appeal there throughout that region that could help Democrats defend that blue wall?
Well, that's what I was about to get to. Was so the question then, when you look at this setup, becomes, Democrats, we already know, in areas like the Twin Cities, in the Midwest and everywhere, Democrats have been doing great here no matter who they're running. So the question is, the areas of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania that are like greater Minnesota, that's where they've been struggling, small towns, blue-collar areas. Did Walz do anything in greater Minnesota that suggests he defies those limitations on Democrats? And the answer really is you don't see it at all in 2022. I mean, what you see is that Walz ran up huge numbers in the Twin Cities and the metro area, just like Joe Biden did in 2020. They look very similar. And then when you get into greater Minnesota here, just for example, this is the kind of county we're talking about where Democrats have been losing ground all around the Midwest. Walz loses Stearns County. This could stand in for dozens. He loses it by 23 points. When Joe Biden was running, he loses it by 23 points. This is the kind of place, let's turn the clock back a dozen years to Barack Obama running in 2012. This is the kind of place Democrats in the pre-Trump era, they weren't necessarily winning, but they were pretty competitive. And that was true in greater Minnesota. That was true in small-town Wisconsin. That was true in small-town Michigan. That was true in small-town Pennsylvania. That is where the floor has fallen out for Democrats since Donald Trump emerged. Now, Tim Walz won in 2022, obviously, but he didn't show any new strength in the parts of Minnesota where the Democrats have really fallen behind in the Trump area. And if you're talking about boosting the Democrats in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, you're talking about, can you do something in those parts of those states where the Democrats have been losing all that ground? Looking at what Walz did in Minnesota, you don't see that value add.
Okay. Steve Kornacki, thank you for breaking it down for us. We appreciate it. Let's turn now to Simone Sanders Townsend, someone who once worked for Vice President Kamala Harris, so understands her thought process in something like this. I'm struck by what Peter said off the top of the program, Simone, about that meeting that Governor Walz had with the vice president, where she seemed to really come away from that meeting with a good feeling about the two of them as a partner and a governing team. How important do you think that meeting was in this final decision-making process?
I think the meeting was critical, honestly. Vice President Harris did not know Governor Walz well before. I think something folks haven't really mentioned throughout the day today is that Governor Walz is, in fact, the chair of the Democratic Governors Association, the political arm that is there to help elect Democratic governors across the country. And before you're the chair, you're the first vice chair. And so he had been involved with this White House and engaged. So, the vice president obviously knew him. They had a general working relationship, but didn't know him as well as, say, someone like Roy Cooper, frankly, whom she served when she was an AG in California. So that meeting was critical because if she's thinking that, okay, maybe this is someone I would like to work with, the chemistry that you have initially is quite telling. Folks say you will know when you get into the room. And the vice president is someone who she wants the staff and the senior advisors around her to give their opinion. She wants to know what the recommendation is, but ultimately she is going to make the decision. And I think the decision did come down because of the truncated timeline, right? The decision came down to taking a look at all of the vetting materials, taking the recommendations from the staff that they had. And it's my understanding that there were folks that came down on multiple different sides of different camps. But how did you feel when you sat down with the person? And also, what kind of governing partner do you think that person would be? The reality here is that Vice President Harris, if she is elected to the presidency, she'll be a young president, someone who would probably want to run for re-election. Do you want to pick a running mate that will eventually be your vice president that you maybe have to look over your shoulder at for the next 4 years, or someone that you believe is going to back you 100%, give you, real honest feedback in private, but back you in public, regardless of what they may personally think? Frankly, the role of a vice president that she knows well because she does that now for President Biden. And obviously, she came away from all of her meetings believing that Governor Walz could be that person for her. You never know for sure, especially not in this truncated timeline, but she went with her gut.
So the two biggest days for vice presidential candidates are today, the day that they're announced, and then the second would be a potential debate. There isn't one on the docket yet, but we assume that that's something that could happen down the road. What's your gut as to what a J.D. Vance, Tim Walz debate would look like?
Frankly, if the debate were held within the next week or so, and obviously there's not one that's currently negotiated, so this is not a real scenario, I think the debate what you would hear from Senator Vance would be very similar to what you heard from him in that press conference. I believe that Republican operatives and the Trump campaign specifically are just trying to throw things at the wall and see what sticks. That's what they've been doing as it relates to Vice President Harris. They really have not attacked her directly on the record. They don't have criticism of the Biden-Harris record as much as you hear criticism about you know, the fact that she's a woman or race, right? And similar with Governor Walz, J.D. Vance is just painted with a broad stroke brush there in the words that we heard from the presser. He also, you know, tried to inject some, what I would argue is just very disturbing language, frankly, about bowing to the Hamas wing of the Democratic Party. I would know that there's no Hamas wing of the Democratic Party. Hamas is a terrorist organization. So that, frankly, in the initial hours is what we've heard. Now, a vice presidential debate, Ryan, as you know, is very different than the presidential. Vice presidential debates, they're seated usually. It is a little more demure. These are candidates that they probably don't cross on the campaign trail much, right? And there's usually only one of them. A presidential debate, and if this were a normal presidential election season, we'd had a couple of them, at least 3, maybe 4. We may not even get one. So Governor Walz has a record as having been a governor, a member of Congress, right, a teacher at one point in time, and some legislative accomplishments. Senator Vance does not have that, and therefore the depth, if you will, that Senator Vance could bring to what is a heavy policy conversation, because that is usually how vice presidential debates go, I don't know if it exists. So I don't actually know if we'll ever see J.D. Vance and Governor Walz sit down, especially if the top of that ticket, Donald Trump, is yet to agree to a debate with Vice President Harris.
Yeah, you're right. It probably will be difficult to have that without the former. Simone, thank you so much for your perspective. We appreciate it as always.
Obviously, the big news of the day is that Tim Walz has been nominated as the VP, or is now the presumptive nominee, I should say, for Kamala Harris. My view on it is it just highlights how radical Kamala Harris is. This is a person who listened to the Hamas wing of her own party and selecting a nominee. This is a guy who's proposed shipping more manufacturing jobs to China, who wants to make the American people more reliant on garbage energy instead of good American energy, and has proposed defunding the police just as Kamala Harris does. I think it's interesting, actually, they make an interesting tag team because, of course, Tim Walz allowed rioters to burn down Minneapolis in the summer of 2020, and then the few who got caught, Kamala Harris helped bail them out of jail. So it is more instructive for what it says about Kamala Harris, that she doesn't care about the border, she doesn't care about crime, she doesn't care about American energy, and most importantly, she doesn't care about the Americans who have been made to suffer under those policies.
Joining me now is our team, NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell on the convention floor. Vaughn Hilliard is in North Carolina, where former President Trump spoke this afternoon. And with me on set, of course, is NBC News chief political analyst Chuck Todd. Kelly O, let's start things off with you. You have been reporting on what we can expect to hear from Governor Walz tonight. Obviously, his challenge is really filling in the blanks. Who is Tim Walz? What are you hearing about what we can expect to hear from him?
Well, Christian, advisors tell him to acknowledge that. Treat it like a blank slate, that the country probably doesn't know much about you, so tell the whole story. And they will do that in a couple of ways. They will emphasize his life of service as a teacher, as a coach, as someone who spent 24 years in the National Guard and then chose to serve in Congress and as governor of Minnesota. Part of what will be different is they are not having Gwen Walz, who is his wife and the First Lady of Minnesota, introduce him. Instead, they'll have a student do that, and they are having Gwen Walz narrate a video that will tell us a lot of those pieces about the dad, emphasizing the rural roots, and some of the personality stuff to introduce Governor Walz in a way that they hope will be relatable. We were able to get an exclusive advance clip of that. Here's a portion of it.
Then Tim's students inspired him to run for Congress in southern Minnesota. Tim spent a lot of time working with Republicans, fighting to help farmers and expanding veterans' benefits. Whether it was in Congress or as governor, his focus has always been helping working people like those he grew up with.
Part of the intent is for Tim Walz to be someone who can speak to rural parts of the country, the blue wall states, and to be someone that is relatable in some ways that maybe Democrats have had a harder time trying to attract, certainly in the Trump era. And part of his challenge will be to also make the case for Kamala Harris. So expect that to be a big part of what he needs to do tonight. I'm told it will be a personal speech and a patriotic one, and it will certainly be one of the biggest nights of his life. Kristen?
It certainly will be, Kelly. You know, it's interesting because Governor Walz and Vice President Harris didn't exactly have a very close relationship prior to her picking him to serve as her running mate. Where do things stand now, and how will that be on display tonight, Kelly?
Well, one of the things that advisors have talked about is that he has been known to the party. He was the head of the Democratic Governors Association, and people were tracking some of the policies he was carrying out in Minnesota. So known to the party, and then so much of it about the personal connection and chemistry that they were able to build. Also, when his team made him a surrogate prior to Kamala Harris even becoming the nominee, and seeing what he was able to do in telling the Democrat story on cable news and elsewhere helped to advance his case to make him a top choice among the shortlisters, then ultimately her actual choice for running mate. So part of what I've also been told is that the people around Kamala Harris have noticed from the first moment of their interactions that he is Governor Walz, quite comfortable playing a supporting role to Kamala Harris, not feeling like he has to be the lead of the ticket, not feeling like he has to outshine her, but to try to complement what she brings to it. And that, of course, is an asset in the very abbreviated race that they are looking at.
Yeah, and they've really highlighted that in their initial rollout in Philadelphia. Kelly O'Donnell, thank you so much for that. Let's turn to Vaughn Hilliard. Vaughn, 76 days from Election Day. We just heard from former President Trump. Talk about the key takeaways.
Kristen, I think the top takeaway is the number that you just mentioned, 76 days until Election Day. And why is that pertinent? Well, 4 years ago, we learned that Election Day was really just the beginning, and that for the next 2 months, the transfer of power was more than rocky, but it was violent. On January 6th, there were hundreds, thousands of individuals who attacked the U.S. Capitol to try to stop the certification of Joe Biden's win and from him taking the White House. And that was due in large part to Donald Trump making the claims repeatedly that the 2020 election had been stolen. And in these last weeks, we have heard Donald Trump begin to lay the foundation for the ability to claim in 2024 here, just 2.5 months from now, that this election is stolen from him. And quite explicitly on this stage here, just a few moments ago, Kristen, Donald Trump, he said explicitly, our primary focus is not to get out the vote. It is to make sure they don't cheat, because we have all the votes we'll need. You can see it, all the houses along the ways with all the signs. We have the numbers. And so Donald Trump, at a time in the last weeks in which he has openly questioned whether the crowds that Kamala Harris is garnering across the country are real, and also the reality that he has argued that the New York case against him amounts to election interference. He's also claimed that Google is interfering in this election. Donald Trump here telling the crowd that he has the numbers to win this election, and all but essentially stating that the only way that he would lose this election is if the other side here cheats. And so I think this has been a very difficult month for Donald Trump, watching his poll numbers flip with Kamala Harris going to the top of the ticket. And we are now watching him in real time, effectively laying the groundwork to claim that the 2024 election is stolen. So really, Donald Trump is saying it very clearly that his effort is not towards trying to get out the vote at this point, because he feels like he already has the numbers, and he is highlighting the idea that this election would potentially be stolen again, as of course he falsely claimed the 2020 election was.
All right, Vaughn Hilliard, thank you so much for that from North Carolina. As you've been talking, we've been listening to a sound check here. Stevie Wonder, he just wrapped up, I think. Can we see him on stage? Yeah, we can still see him there on stage. We should say that we saw John Legend doing a sound check earlier today. So things are really getting underway. The energy is building here inside the United Center. And I am here with Chuck Todd to talk about all of it. So here we are on day 3. Chuck, before we talk about what you're expecting tonight, let's talk about what happened last night.
Yeah.
The fact that we saw Michelle Obama, who frankly we have never seen before. What did you make of what we heard from her and from the former president?
Well, look, she's had a lot to get off her chest.
Yes,
okay,
that's
and that's what it felt like, right? I got some things to say, right? And we also know that there's a personal issue between her and the Bidens. And it's personal. It's not political. It's not, we know it's personal. You guys want to Google what that is. I encourage you to do it. I'm not going to go down that storyline. but she wouldn't have been here if this were Joe Biden's convention. And so I think that's an important thing to understand, which made her early lines going, I'm feeling something finally, you know, instead of the pit in my stomach. It wasn't a personal shot. Some people want to say it's a personal shot at the Bidens. No, it was a shot at the era that we were in. And the fact that she wasn't alone here. She was speaking to all those voters, the double haters, the people that couldn't stand the fact that it was Biden and Trump were the choices. And there were some, 70% of the country wanting different choices. So that's what I thought she is so good at, which is sort of getting out of the predictable left-right political paradigms. And, I think we sort of, there's almost this, well, of course she gave a great speech. And I'm sitting there going, she doesn't do this for a living.
Right.
Yeah, of course Obama gave a great speech. Of course, they did it for a living. Every 4 years, we all are reminded going, oh my God, this is one of the best public speakers in America.
Right.
And she's not, a practicing politician, if you will. So, look, I think she did it. She was sort of, she hit Trump with elegance.
She didn't go low necessarily.
Right. It wasn't high, but it wasn't like, below the belt.
Right.
It was this a little bit mockery, which I do think that both of the Obamas went there, and that's the biggest tone change from Biden to Harris, right? Biden was painting a picture of this dark, menacing Donald Trump. Obama's always treated Donald Trump as the celebrity apprentice host, right? I mean, going back to the White House Correspondents' Dinner riff back in 2011 to the I've been amused at all the different euphemisms that were used today to describe the joke about crowd sizes that the former president made.
And the gesture that accompanied it.
Yes, and it was probably something a lot more people on television saw perhaps than some people in the room fully. You could see it was sort of like an on the way Homer, right? That's where some of them got it later. But that is the big tone change, which is, and Tim Walz has been doing that too. And I expect more of that. That's the through line I expect from last night to tonight. Is that I think Tim Walz will continue the mockery of Trump versus the dark, menacing threat that Biden was always painting.
It's such a fascinating point because Biden won with that messaging in 2020, but it seemed like people couldn't hear that anymore in 2024.
Like I think especially when the economy was kind of crummy, right? You're like, well, it's all dark.
Right.
You're not more light. Yeah. That was the problem. Biden himself wasn't presenting light.
Yeah. So here we are, and you said Monday night really was official pass the torch night. Yesterday was Kamala Harris's convention starting in earnest. Tonight is a huge test for Governor Tim Walz. You have 4 in 10 Americans saying they don't really know enough about him to know whether they trust him or not. What are you going to be looking for tonight?
Look, it's a huge opportunity for him, And I actually, we haven't had this this least known of a running mate since Sarah Palin. And I think it's instructive to go back to Sarah Palin because Sarah Palin electrified her convention.
Yeah.
Sarah Palin had a tremendous first 20 days. And yet she was also an unknown figure, so her mistakes were also could overshadow things. But she gave a terrific speech because she came at it as an every person, right? And that's what Walz, I think. So assuming that's the theme, she went with hockey mom. Right. He's going with, girl dad, right, type of thing. But I think there's something to that if the more he leans on being a public school teacher, being a coach, sort of growing up middle class, living a middle class life before jumping into the political arena, I think that certainly is going to connect with this room. People need to remember a lot of the delegates are teachers. Yeah. The teachers union is always a huge, and so he's really going to play well in this room. But Kelly O'Donnell made a point earlier to me, and which was, hey, teachers know how to. They know how to explain things to keep the attention of people. Like it's tough to get teenagers to listen to you. Right. So that's probably a real asset to him.
That's a great point.
He will be speaking American, not necessarily political Washington.
Well, speaking of explaining things, and you and I were talking about this, obviously we covered the Obama administration together. And when he was running for re-election, Bill Clinton played the role of explainer-in-chief.
Right, particularly on economics because Barack Obama could not run, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago because of the Great Recession. They had a twist. They changed the message to, are you going to be better off 4 years from now?
From now.
And that's what Bill Clinton helped do.
Yeah, and it seemed like former President Obama was taking that mantle a little bit, elder statesman, and starting to explain to people, here's why Kamala Harris will be better for you ultimately.
Well, and I really think what he did very well, and so did Michelle Obama, was separate Kamala Harris from the Joe Biden wing of the party. If you think about it, Obama was sort of the new fresh face. Yeah. Progressives thought he was one of them. And I think he was not on any camp, I think, as it turns out. But he felt like he had to go with a little bit of the old guard, and so Biden was the old guard. You could actually see here, Biden was the old guard. He went with Kamala Harris. She was part of the, quote, new guard, or part of that. So this has always kind of been a fusion here, even though they're all, been working together. And I think that this is an opportunity Kamala Harris has, is to separate herself from Biden without being rude about it. Yeah. But to say, hey, I came up differently than Biden. I didn't come up through the political wars of the 70s. The most appealing thing about Barack Obama is that he didn't go through the wars of the 90s. And that's, I think, and the wars of the 90s so shaped the Bidens, the Clintons. And to this day, it shapes Hillary Clinton. You can still feel that. Biden is still sort of, you can feel that he was shaped by those culture wars of the 90s. Obama, that's what made him such a fresh face here. And I think that's Kamala Harris's possibility. And that's what Obama, I thought, really did well with last night, was making the case, hey, she's not a veteran of those old culture wars. She will go about this differently.
Yeah, very quickly, because I'm getting a wrap.
I know you are.
We're learning RFK Jr. is going to make a speech on Friday, teasing the possibility of dropping out, maybe endorsing Trump. How big of a deal would that be?
Well, he needs to hurry up and drop out to be relevant.
Yeah.
Because every day he was losing relevance. Yeah. Every day his numbers were shrinking. Every day his donors were going away. I don't think he has any juice left. Yeah. I'll be honest. The candidate switch took away 75% of his support that was at all Democratic. They're already back with Harris. What's left, I think, is gadfly vote. I don't think it even goes to Trump. I think this is a much ado about nothing now. I think this is gadfly candidate drops out. There's only coverage if we choose to cover it.
Well, you called it first when there was a change at the top of the ticket that the third-party candidate
just all go away. And it's mostly, there's always going to be 2 to 4% of the people not wanting major part, but that's the norm.
Yeah. All right. Chuck, great to see you.
Thanks,
we'll be watching together
see you later.
tonight. Thank you, for sure.
So listen, for the Republican reaction to Governor Tim Walz's speech, let's bring in his opponent, of course, on the other side of the aisle, Ohio Senator and Republican Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance. Senator Vance, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Okay, just making sure you can hear us okay. Let me ask you this. There were some attacks leveled against you here tonight at the convention, including from Pete Buttigieg, who suggested that you believe that people essentially don't count if they are, for example, childless or not the kind of family that you want to see them be. How do you respond to that?
Well, of course I don't believe that. I think that everybody has worth, and certainly you have a lot of people who just haven't had families. It hasn't worked out for them for reasons they can't control, and that's, of course, totally fine. I think what I have said is that we want our country to be more pro-family, and more to the point, what I worry about when I watch the Democratic convention speeches tonight is there's no reference to how we're going to lower the costs of groceries and housing for middle-class families. There's no reference to how Kamala Harris's policies have closed the border because, of course, they've opened the border. What they've done here is they've basically made an argument that if you vote for Donald Trump and you want change and you want a better future for your children, that somehow you're a bad person. What I think what the Democrats should do is actually point to Kamala Harris's record and point out how her policies have made people better off, not attack me and Donald Trump, and most importantly, the people who vote for us because they're unhappy with Kamala Harris's policies and what they've done to the country.
You know, Senator Vance, Governor Walz took some shots at you tonight. He made fun of the fact that you went to Yale. He says, like all regular people, I grew up in the heartland. J.D. Vance studied at Yale. He said that you trashed your own people in your best-selling novel and that your career was funded by Silicon Valley billionaires. When you meet Governor Walz face-to-face in that debate on October 1st, what are you going to tell him?
Well, first of all, what a nasty personal attack. Why isn't Governor Walz talking about Kamala Harris's record and how she's made the lives of the American people better? The answer is because he can't say that. He can't point to her policies that have lowered inflation, lowered the price of housing. He can't point to her policies that have lowered the cost of food. So he's attacking me in a very personal way. Look, I signed up for it, but I want Tim Walz to articulate how his vice presidency is going to make the lives of the American people better. Look, I was raised by a grandmother in a poor family family where my grandmother didn't even graduate from high school. She made a lot of sacrifices towards the end of her life to ensure that I had access to some good educational opportunities. I think my family ought to be praised for sacrificing to give me some opportunities. That's the story we see all across our country. I'm incredibly proud, not just of what I've accomplished, but most importantly, at the sacrifices my mom and grandmother made so that I could have a chance at the American dream. That's a good thing to me, and if Tim Walz wants to attack it, he's welcome to, but why don't he talk about what he wants to do for the American people?
Your running mate has suggested that the issue of reproductive rights, he believes, is not going to be a big factor come November. Democrats are making the opposite bet, and that has been very evident here at the convention in Chicago with the issue of reproductive rights, access to abortion, and access to fertility treatments very much on the table. Can you get specific about what your ticket would do to protect IVF, to protect fertility treatments like IUI?
Well, look, we support access to fertility treatments and want parents to be able to access this stuff even if they can't afford it, because we believe that babies and children are good and we want more Americans to have families. Now, the real contrast, of course, is that Donald Trump has said that he thinks abortion policy should be made at the state level. And meanwhile, Tim Walz and Kamala Harris are talking about taxpayer-funded late-term abortion, about shutting down Christian hospitals because they don't want to perform certain types of abortions. Look, that is not how you respect differences of opinion. I think what Donald Trump is really trying to do is be pro-family and articulate a solution to some of these culture war topics that allows the country to come together and solve some of these disputes at the state level where voters can make these decisions, not the national government.
But he hasn't committed to not seeking a federal abortion ban. Will you do that tonight?
Well, Donald Trump has explicitly said that he doesn't support a national abortion ban, and he wants California to make California's abortion policy, and he wants Ohio to make Ohio's abortion policy. And again, I think it's important to recognize the moral leadership that Donald Trump is showing here. He's saying we want to have a compromise here. Let the states and the people in those states make the determination about abortion policy. The national government, we're going to focus on lowering the cost of food, lowering the cost of housing, fighting back against the Chinese theft of our manufacturing jobs. That's what our national government should be focused on. And by the way, it's not just vision and talk from Donald Trump. He actually delivered these things during a very successful four-year presidential term. Really, in some ways, the contrast here is between the failed leadership of Kamala Harris, the successful leadership of Donald Trump. Look, we can get back to peace and prosperity. We just have to elect Donald Trump as president of the United States.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.